Okay, we're recording. We got a good number of people already attending, so I guess we could start. So it's a pleasure to be back for this new academic year for the Breathing Cities seminar. As you know, these are the seminars organized by the Future Urban Ventilation Network. Today, we have the pleasure to have Peter Bedwell from the UK Health Security Agency. Pete has over 15 years of experience in radiological assessment modeling, specializing in atmospheric dispersion modeling of radionuclides. Before I hand it over to him, just a quick thing that please mute yourself during the talk. You have a chance to ask questions at the end. If you have questions during the seminar, please write it down in the chat, then I might ask you to unmute at the end and ask the question yourself. For the moment, please keep the camera off just to save bandwidth, and over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the invite to present my work today at the breathing seminar. So yeah, my name is Pete Bedwell. I've worked for UKHSA for over 20 years now. You might be more familiar with Public Health England or Health Protection Agency or the National Radiological Protection Board, so that they are all sort of former guises of what is now UK Health Security Agency. But actually over that 20-year period of working under a different name, my role and work area has stayed the same. So over that 20-year period, I've been developing expertise in the provision of public health advice as a result of radiation in the environment, and also as a sort of an aside or an addition, developing expertise in the field of atmospheric dispersion. So my work is mostly applying models. There's some model development. There's no lab-based work in my field of work. However, there are colleagues outside of our department who are lab-based and that we do work with on certain topics. The presentation is going to be largely applied, much less sort of theoretical. So hopefully it'll ease you in to the seminar after the summer break. So let's step into the slides. So I work in a department called the Radiation Assessments Department. These 4 bullet points are a summary of the work areas that we're involved in. So it's mainly assessing human radiation doses. We're much less interested in the impact of radiation on the environment. That's mainly sort of the Environment Agency that would prioritize that. But we are especially interested in radioactivity in the environment. So, not things like mobile phones, that's dealt with in other departments, but the impact of radioactivity in the environment on human health. So we do undertake some research, but most of our work is developing guidance, developing tools and models, and applying tools and models. And a lot of it is looking at how radioactivity moves through the environment. So that might be moving through the atmosphere, it might be moving through the terrestrial environment, how it moves through the soil, how it concentrates in plants and into animals, how it moves into waterways, so through rivers, into the sewer system and into the marine environment. So they're the typical sort of environments that we're interested in. Most of our information and advice is provided, ultimately the focus is providing that information to the public, but often it's not directly to the public. Often it's through channels like government departments, and agencies. And we also work closely with international colleagues and international organizations. So for example, the European Commission, the World Health Organization, the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, and also the International Atomic Energy Agency. So we do a lot of work internationally as well. So I work on the emergency side in the emergency consequences group, and our work is typically split into two areas. So emergency preparedness and emergency response, where the preparedness side takes a lot more of our time and effort than the response side, thankfully. So we develop tools and methods both for the emergency response and for planning or what if type scenarios. And we do a lot of that in collaboration with Met Office. So for response, we've got a system called the Joint Agency Model, which is a collaborative approach between Met Office, ourselves, and some other organizations. For planning and what if scenarios, we've developed an in-house system called PACE. And whilst that is developed purely in-house, it applies the Met Office's atmospheric dispersion model name. So there's a number of topics that we're interested in, and a lot of those surround nuclear power plants and the potential accidents that may occur there. But we're also interested in things like CBRN type incidents on the terrorist threat. So things like dirty bombs in place devices. We're not the regulator. The Office of Nuclear Regulation provide most of the regulatory side of things, but we do provide a lot of the scientific evidence that supports the regulations. We have quite a lot of links with universities, and we're continually trying to develop those. In the recent times, we've done some good work with the University of Reading. And we try and collaborate a lot with our sort of sister organizations in other countries. So for example, our RSN in France. On the emergency response side, we would have to provide a team in response to a radiation emergency. So we've provided teams, for example, for the Fukushima accident in Japan in 2011. You might wonder why we did that, actually, but because we have to provide the Foreign and Commonwealth offices of those nations with information and to provide advice for UK nationals wherever they might be around the world. We tend to have to respond to incidents wherever they happen to be across the globe. So we actually did quite a lot of work following Fukushima, the accident of Fukushima, and then also other accidents or incidents like the poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko with polonium that happened in London. So we had to do a lot of work at the time there. So that's some background information in terms of what we sort of generally do day to day. What I wanted to talk about here was sheltering. And there's some interesting aspects that are required to understand to get a better understanding of sheltering. So for example, ingress into buildings, the protection of the health of individuals indoors, and dispersion modeling in an urban environment. And they're all quite key elements to better understanding how effective sheltering is likely to be as a protective action. And they're also topics that I think are quite relevant to the breathing city community. So you can see the synergies between hopefully this presentation and what the audience will I think are interested in. So there's a number of exposure pathways that we tend to be interested in. So these are routes of exposure where an individual might be impacted by radiation. So this is considering a discharge into the environment, and then the subsequent atmospheric dispersion, some deposition. It might be via dry processes or wet processes. And then the exposure pathways. So you might be externally exposed from the plume or the cloud. There might be some external mainly the ground, but not exclusively the ground. Inhalation from the plume, ingestion of contaminated foodstuffs, and exposure from material that's deposited on the skin. In terms of sheltering, the exposure pathways that sheltering can most mitigate are the two external exposure pathways and also inhalation. And the one I'm going to focus on here, because I think it'll be most of interest to the audience, is the inhalation exposure pathway. So in terms of sheltering and what it is, so our definition is it's the practice of individuals remaining indoors or moving indoors from an outdoor environment in order to protect themselves from a hazard which originates in that outdoor environment. So sheltering as a protective action can reduce the radiation dose experienced by the exposure of individuals. But there are other protective actions. So one of those, in addition to sheltering, is evacuation. There are others as well. Sheltering and evacuation are two of the key ones. Evacuation, assuming equivalent level of planning of both evacuation and sheltering, is generally considered to be a bit more disruptive and potential for more danger. So there are some benefits, perceived benefits of sheltering. And actually, when you look at most countries' emergency plans around nuclear power plants, sheltering tends to be a significant part of those plans. So there's a term that we give called the dose reduction factor. So you get a level of protection from the radiation in the outdoor environment as a result of sheltering. And that level of protection can be represented by what we term to be a dose reduction factor, or DRF. So this DRF is the ratio of the dose actually received with the protection action in place to the dose that would have been received without any protective actions. So essentially that's the dose received if you're sheltering to the dose that you would have received if you weren't sheltering or essentially outdoors. And in the simple case of remaining indoors throughout the incident, you can just consider this simple ratio of the time integrated concentrations of being outdoors to being indoors. And ultimately, so nuclear power plants have these emergency plans. These will detail sheltering as part of the plans, and the sheltering might be required depending on the size of the incident, and depending on the size of the incidents, the sheltering might be required to a certain distance, typically of order of up to a few kilometers from the site. Now, in terms of defining a suitable dose reduction factor in those assessments to what we should recommend in our emergency plans, we need a generic value of the dose reduction factor, because when we're planning for these potential accidents, we don't actually know what the weather's going to be like. We don't know what the source term will be. We know there's a range of weathers. We know there's a range of possible source terms. So we're looking for a generic value of the dose reduction factor for planning, and crucially, a generic value which is representative of UK conditions. So that was one of the things we wanted. That's one of the values we need to identify in our assessments. So historically, we have some formal advice on dose reduction factors, and that's detailed in a publication called Brown 1988, which considers the effectiveness of sheltering. And that's our primary reference, or has been our primary reference historically. And Brown recommends a dose reduction factor of 0.3 to 0.5 for radionuclides which deposit across a range of accident release scenarios for what they defined as a typical building in the UK. So the dose reduction factor range of 0.3 to 0.5 presented by Brown was founded on 7 experimental studies, and all but one of those studies was based outside of the UK. because that's what was available, certainly at the time. So the sole UK-based study comprised of measurements of iodine-131 in aerosol form following the Windscale fire accident in 1961. So the majority of the measurements were performed a week after the accident. None of the measurements were performed during or immediately after the accident. The buildings considered in those measurements were generally not in use. Some of the windows were open during the accident, and the buildings comprised of an office and a 2-story stone-built house. There was also a wooden hut at the old Harwell Air Base that was considered. So what's really key here is essentially a lot of this evidence was not very representative of UK housing stock and UK weather conditions, and what limited information there was, it was quite accident specific rather than very sort of broad brush and generic. And because it wasn't very focused on UK housing stock and UK weather conditions, the value 0.3 to 0.5 was deemed not to be ideally representative, and ideally we would be able to do something better than that. So what we wanted to do was perform a review to see if we could identify a better range or values across than the 0.3 to 0.5, and look to seek to update our dose reduction factor advice. So the first thing we wanted to do was look into habit and housing stock data for the UK. So we identified a reference, this time use survey, and that was quite significant because it stated that overall individuals in the UK spend most of their time at home. So if we're looking for a generic value, it makes sense to apply that to dwellings where people live, because that's where they spend the majority of their time. Then looking at publication by the Department for Communities and Local Government. Where they're looking at housing stock data, they published that over half of English housing stock was constructed prior to 1964 and over 85% prior to 1990. Approximately 52% of dwelling types were just more discrete types of buildings like semi-detached, detached and bungalows. And they identified that 62% of dwelling types existed in regions described as suburban. So a typical dwelling in the UK, you could describe as being sort of pre-1990, a single semi-type dwelling in a suburban area. So we described that as sort of most representative of a UK dwelling. We were also interested in whether dwellings typically have a chimney breast or not. We couldn't actually identify any information of whether they more typically do or don't have chimney breasts. But from researching the information that's provided in the emergency plans, it's explicitly stated that if you do have a chimney breast, you shouldn't shelter in the room where the chimney breast resides. You should shelter in one of the other rooms. So we took that into account as well in our work. So what we wanted to do was try and do some modeling. And so initially what we did was we looked at this infiltration compartmental model, where actually we're just looking at a really simple approach which had 2 compartments, an outdoor compartment and an indoor compartment. And we were just considering 4 processes where there was an air exchange between the indoor and outdoor environments. There was filtration from the building envelope. There was indoor deposition within the dwelling, and there was radioactive UK. And then what we were able to do, we were able to, well, we decided to try and simplify the approach where possible. And so we did that by way of these aspects listed in the bullet points here. So we were considering a uniform air concentration both in the indoor and outdoor environment. And by uniform, what I mean here is uniform in space, not uniform in time. So in the indoor environment, a uniform air concentration is potentially more appropriate in a small room, like in a dwelling in a house, than in a very large building like a warehouse, something more industrial. But that's okay because we're thinking about dwellings rather than commercial buildings. We're aware that the outdoor air concentration, in reality, there would be a concentration profile around building. So we looked at what that would be affected by, and it seemed to be affected by factors such as wind speed, wind direction, the surrounding structures, topography, and building height. Now, the latter two, topography and building height, were not deemed to be such an issue, partly because for a lot of the nuclear power plants, they're in relatively flat terrain, so that the topography is quite simple. And in terms of building height, we identified on the previous slide that we're looking at relatively low-rise buildings. So we didn't think either of those were necessarily going to be significant issues. Also, for the dwellings that are in the vicinity of nuclear power plants, they're at least 1 kilometre away, and typically of order of a few kilometres away from the nuclear power plant, so where the plume is relatively mixed. So we thought a uniform air concentration in the outdoor environment were easy to make. So it's assumed that an individual remains indoors throughout the incident. I think that's a fair assumption to make. The individuals are advised to remain indoors throughout sheltering, in the advice that's given in an emergency response. It was assumed that indoor air concentrations are 0 both at the start and the end of the calculation. There's also assumed that lambda E, so the air exchange rate, and lambda D, so the indoor deposition rate, don't vary as a function of time. So this is an interesting assumption. Lambda E, for example, we are aware that it's can be significantly affected by things like the weather. The weather varies over timescales of hours typically, maybe in extreme circumstances in minutes, but let's say typically over hours. So for releases of duration that are instantaneous over the order of minutes or up to a small number of hours, that approximation is probably reasonable. And then it was assumed that lambda E and lambda D are significantly greater than lambda R. Now lambda R, the radioactive decay, for the radionuclides that are most significant from these types of accidents, we're talking about timescales of days. So that applied. F is the building envelope filtration factor. And in a reference that we identified that was Byrne 2009, they describe that generally the indoor deposition is more dominant process than the envelope filtration. So in this instance, we assumed a value of F equals 1. So if you make all those assumptions, you can whittle your dose reduction factor down to something that's dependent on just 2 parameters, your air exchange rate and your indoor deposition rate, where the dose reduction factor is lambda E divided by the sum of lambda E and plus lambda D. So quite a simplistic approach. But then, of course, you've got to identify suitable values for lambda E and lambda D. So we identified that UK dwellings are overwhelmingly naturally ventilated. The recommendations that are provided in the information given to individuals that live locally to nuclear power plants in the emergency planning information say that all mechanical ventilation should be switched off in the event of an emergency. And then there was quite a key bit of work that we used. Our chemical colleagues funded some work that was undertaken by BRE, which is the Building Research Establishment, and they used their wind tunnel to do some dispersion experiments. And off the back of that, they derived an empirical model. And as I say, that work was funded by chemical colleagues, and they developed some notable data sets. And if that is of interest, I think our chemical colleagues are happy to share those data sets. And if you're interested in that, you can get in touch with James Stewart Evans, who I think is recognised by the seminar community. But if not, you can get in touch with me, and I can pass on your details. But essentially, the wind tunnel experiments were designed to improve understanding of the impact of wind and stack pressure on air exchange rate of a building. And this empirical model to model the ingress into a building then took account of building characteristics, and notably the age and type of building, the region type, so whether it is urban, suburban or rural, and also the meteorological conditions, notably wind speed and temperature. So what we were able to do is we were able to apply a building air permeability to that model, that ingress model. And we were also able to apply an average wind speed and an average temperature to that model to determine an air exchange rate. So we looked in the literature and identified an air permeability of 12 meter cubed per hour meter squared, which is understood to be representative of a typical UK building. And then we looked at meteorological data sets spanning 3 years for 4 different UK coastal sites, hourly data sets, and identified mean wind speeds and mean temperatures. Actually, if you apply the hourly values throughout and then average later the air exchange rate, it works out to be the same value. So it doesn't matter that you take the mean wind speed and temperature initially. Apply those back to the model. So the idea is now we're applying UK representative values, and we determined a mean air exchange rate of 0.6 per hour and an air exchange rate range of 0.5 to 0.7. So what we're saying is there a typical generic value for the UK for the types of scenarios that we're interested in. But as well as an air exchange rate, we need to understand the indoor deposition rate. So we're interested in what factors predominantly affect indoor deposition velocity, and some key factors are particle size, the amount of furnishings in a room, and the indoor air movement. So we look to identify typical particle size by looking at some of the accidents that have happened historically from nuclear power plants. It was also helpful that that range of particle sizes, for that range of particle sizes, which is of a few tenths to a few microns, you don't get, so if you look here, you don't get a huge range across that particle size in your deposition rate. If the particles had been a lot larger, we would have had a lot we'd have had a lot more spread of the deposition rate over particle size. So that was sort of quite helpful. It was assumed that the majority of rooms in dwellings in the UK are furnished, so we were mainly interested in this third graph. And the advice is when individuals shelter to close all windows and doors. And on the basis of that, it was assumed that the indoor air velocity would be relatively small. So we estimated a indoor deposition rate range of 0.3 to 0.5 per hour. So here we've got a table of dose reduction factors ranging from a value of 0.17 to 0.93. And these range of values are a function of the indoor deposition rate and the air exchange rate. And they are derived on the basis of the simple approach where the dose reduction factor equals lambda E divided by the sum of lambda E plus lambda D. And we're particularly interested in what I've highlighted here in this, well, this dashed square, where we identified previously that sort of a generic representative UK range was an indoor deposition rate of 0.3 to 0.5 and an air exchange rate of 0.5 to 0.7. So it gave us an estimate of a dose reduction factor in the range of 0.5 to 0.7 with a best estimate of 0.6. When we looked at the literature of dose reduction factors, we were unable to identify any dose reduction factors where the studies were for UK specific conditions and relevant to sort of radiological accidents. There were some studies done for non-UK based experiments. Some of those values supported a value of 0.6. Of those values that supported a value of 0.6, some were more typical of UK conditions, some were less typical of UK conditions. Other experiments didn't support a value of 0.6, and where they didn't support a value of 0.6, predominantly they presented smaller dose reduction factor values. Most of those studies were based in mainland Europe, where the wind speeds we understand were typically less, and the housing more modern and less leaky, and also mostly experimental studies where the dose reduction factors were understood to be commonly derived on the basis of not considering the entirety of the passage of the plume, with purging the indoor environment towards the end of the passage of the plume. So I think for a lot of the experimental studies, maybe waiting for the indoor and outdoor air concentrations to equilibrate was perhaps a bit less practical for those. So for those reasons, we could understand why for these sort of non-UK based studies, they would be predominantly presenting smaller dose reduction factors. So ultimately, what we've come to so far is a generic value, a generic dose reduction factor value of 0.6. So that's what we've estimated, and that's a generic UK value primarily for emergency planning applications when the weather conditions and the housing stock are largely unknown. So in terms of all what I presented so far, that work has largely been written up and will be published in due course, hopefully soon. However, what about under emergency response conditions, when there's likely to be significantly more confidence in the prevailing weather conditions, and potentially more confidence in the housing stock of concern or the types of dwellings? To So the question I guess we've got in our minds is, can a more scenario-specific dose reduction factor be applied? So something better than the generic 0.6 value that was previously derived for emergency planning. The caveat to that is the necessity for sort of clear and concise advice. And so there's always going to be a likelihood for a need of a single dose reduction factor value. So the rest of the slides I'm presenting, or the last few slides, are much more sort of exploratory type slides. To be honest, sort of almost asking more questions than they answer, really. But giving you a flavour of what we're interested in and how we might continue the work going forward. So one of the first questions was, well, what about adding complexity to the modelling approach? Because what we've done so far is quite simplistic and we've made quite a lot of assumptions. And one assumption that we're really interested in is that lambda E is not to vary with time. And one of the reasons we're really interested in that is, whilst a radiological accident might have an instantaneous release, it might go on for a number of hours, even 1 or 2 days. And over those timescales, we know the weather can change significantly, and therefore we understand that lambda E can change significantly. So revising that assumption would be really interesting. And also thinking about the concentration indoors, CI, that it might not be 0 at either the beginning of the calculation or at the end of the calculation also would be quite interesting. So in that bottom bullet point, we've got a new approach for determining the indoor air concentration. And we'd use that combined with the outdoor air concentration, CO, to determine our dose reduction factor. So we could potentially think about using different modelling approaches. Also, there's so many variables and parameters that can affect the values that we're calculating this dose reduction factor. And it would be nice to think about how they impact our dose reduction factor, and the sensitivities on these values, and how this impacts our DRF. So I've got a whole list of them there. I'm not going to go through them all, but you can imagine some particularly interesting ones. So for example, schools and hospitals. So you can imagine in an accident scenario, we're interested in protecting the whole population, but often there's particular emphasis placed on the most vulnerable in the population, so children, the elderly, the sick. So if people are sheltering in schools or hospitals, can we provide any additional advice? Now, what we may well do actually, especially for children in schools, is prioritise evacuation for those sort of locations. But one thing that was found in Fukushima was that evacuating people from hospitals was a lot more challenging, because individuals were very reliant on the care that they were receiving for their health. So evacuation isn't always an easy option. So sheltering might be the primary option, and therefore, can we provide better advice in schools and hospitals? I do wonder whether the dose reduction factor for those types of buildings would have to be very scenario and individual specific. So I just wanted to mention a few things in the final slides that would be of interest to us. There's a whole range of things I could have picked, but the first one I'm going to describe is vehicles. So what is the protection offered by a vehicle from radioactivity in the environment? Now, you wouldn't necessarily shelter in a vehicle, but what may well happen is people evacuate, Potentially in the evacuation process, there is a significant road congestion, like in the diagram here. What we might actually have is, as well as recommended evacuation, we might have people self-evacuating that are contrary to the recommended advice. Again, that can cause a lot more problems than it solves, and potentially you'll have a situation here where you've got a lot of congestion of vehicles. So you might have stationary vehicles as well as moving vehicles, and we are interested in what the air exchange rates are likely to be for these vehicles. And just in this example, we applied the simple approach, the dose reduction factor being based on the lambda E divided by the sum of lambda E plus lambda D, but we derived some tentative dose reduction factors. And so that sort of thing would be quite interesting to us going forward, to look into that in a bit more detail. Weather is another thing that we're really interested in. So whilst the dose reduction factor that we derived originally, that 0.6, varied little as a function of the annual average meteorological conditions, where we looked at how they vary as a function of the annual average over site and by year of meteorology we considered, those dose reduction factors varied very little in that instance. Actually, once you start looking from hour to hour of your meteorological data, the dose reduction factors vary significantly. So here, that in this table, that's what we've done. We've looked at sort of what could the minimum be, what could the maximum be. And in this instance, it's for a building type of a sort of a single semi building in an urban city environment, in this case with a chimney. And we could see actually that the this is the air exchange rates per hour can vary quite a lot. So you can imagine also your dose reduction factor would vary quite a lot under these different meteorological conditions. So that's something we're quite interested in looking at in more detail. And finally, looking at sheltering strategies in some more detail. So so the things that we're interested in thinking about is, does an individual sheltering, what's the implications of an individual sheltering before the plume, after the plume has arrived? So initially they're outside, they don't get into shelter till the plume has already arrived. And then thinking about when is the optimal time to purge or cleanse the indoor environment once an individual is sheltering. So I've added two graphs here. In the graphs, the red graph indicates the outdoor air concentration, where the y-axis is the air concentration and the x-axis is time. And the green and blue graphs indicate the indoor air concentration. So in the top graph, the sort of first passage of the plume over our receptor point results in quite a complex picture, most notably due to this almost sort of plateauing of the outdoor air concentrations, which results in this sort of extended period where there is a continuous sort of yo-yoing or switching between the outdoor air concentrations being greater than the indoor, and then the indoor air concentrations being greater than the outdoor. So that first passage is quite complex. The second one is more simple, and we can just look at that one for now. And it's primarily simple because you've got a much sharper increase and then sharp decrease of the outdoor air concentrations without this sort of plateauing of the outdoor air concentrations. And you'll see that we've got these periods end, or points on the graph, end, zero and cross, where end is basically this point here, the time at which the indoor concentration tends to zero. Zero is basically this point here, where the time of the first zero outdoor, where that's the time of the first zero outdoor concentration. and then cross is basically this point here, if we come down, which is the time at which the outdoor concentration and indoor concentration cross. So in the bottom graph, the area shaded in red is the dose saving, essentially. So that's as a result of sheltering. So where the outdoor air concentration is greater than the indoor air concentration. And this area in green is the sort of additional accrued dose as a result of continuing to shelter, despite the indoor air concentration being greater than the outdoor air concentration, because the individuals don't know at this point to purge the indoor environment. Now, if they did a perfect purging, all that green area would be removed. But in essence, that wouldn't necessarily happen. And what we've got here are the lines of what would happen if they purged at those 3 points in time. Now, ideally, in this instance at least, the individual would purge the indoor environment, i.e. open the windows and open the doors, somewhere between cross and 0, so somewhere in this period of time. So they actually significantly reduce the dose that they're likely to receive. However, getting a clear and concise and timely message across to the individuals, of course, is very challenging. And that's one of the problems that we're always going to be faced with in emergency response. So just finishing up then for a few conclusions. So what we've done is we've determined a single generic representative UK dose reduction factor of 0.6, which will form a publication hopefully soon. And then we're thinking about some of the things that we could investigate in more detail, both in terms of sort of more complex modeling and the impact of all these different parameters on the dose reduction factor. And I've highlighted some possible areas of future work. So we're quite interested in where best in the building would it be to shelter, and we know there's sort of multi-room models, and we haven't investigated those, but we're interested in the application of those. And I haven't really talked about any of the external side. We've just talked about the inhalation side, but the work that we've done so far has been predominantly based on literature reviews rather than modelling on the external side, and we'd like to do some modelling to better understand the effectiveness of sheltering from external exposure pathways. So I'm going to finish up there. Very welcome comments and questions. If you think of anything after the seminar and would like to get in touch, my email address is at the bottom there. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. It was a very interesting talk, which as an experimentalist, I'm happy to see that there's definitely a need for more experimental data to develop
exactly.
a model. So I can't see any question in the chat. So I'm going to ask you, if you have any question, please just raise your hand and I'll unmute yourself, really. So while we are waiting for some people to maybe try to formulate their questions, I do have a question. I see that for these DRF, a lot of studies to characterize buildings focus on the building itself. I was wondering, how do you think the environment where the buildings are, how important is that factor? So I'm thinking mostly about the neighborhood, so different, because it's not just the building itself, it's just what surrounds it, probably, that has a huge impact on the exchange. But I'm just wondering.
So my understanding is that is significant. The work that BRE did in their wind tunnel, they looked at 3 different regions, and they looked at a rural area, a suburban area, and an urban area. And in their wind tunnel, they changed the density of basically the cubes that they were looking at in the wind tunnel. And looking at the results that they got, that did make an impact. That did have an effect on the ingress. So I think there was a greater amount of ingress in the rural type buildings, and some lesser typically ingress in the more urban type buildings, from what I recall from the work that BRE did.
Yeah, good, thank you. I think there is a question from Tim from the STL. Please.
Yep. Hello. Yeah, very interesting talk. Thank you. Yeah, I just had one simple question. Yeah, you said your filtration factor was 1.
Yeah.
So if it was 1, where is the material coming into the building? Were you assuming it's coming through open windows and things?
No. So we are assuming it's coming through sort of apertures and cracks in the building rather than open windows and doors. So for sort of the particle sizes that we were interested in, it looked like a value of F equals 1 that was appropriate for things, for example, like iodine in elemental vapor form. We understood that you wouldn't consider a value of F equals 1 because iodine in elemental vapor form, as it tried to ingress into the building through those sort of apertures and cracks in the buildings, would be filtered a lot more readily. So if we were to change the nature of the hazard that we were looking at, we would definitely want to seek to change that F value. But for the particle size we were looking at, we understood, and you might have an alternative view, that a value of F equals 1 was appropriate. We also read quite a lot actually about that, for a lot of the experimental work, the filtration at F value was just folded into the indoor deposition value as well. So for some of the studies, it was just folded into the same value.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
That's okay.
I think Tom has a question. Tom, please go ahead.
Go for it.
Peter, thank you.
That's all right.
Yeah, I have a question. Is because you took to compare with internal data somehow, right? That implies you are thinking the source is not far away. It's a sort of a near distant source. My point is to you is for this simple model, whether it's important or is a key point to consider the distance to the source.
That is an interesting point, and I don't have a feel for how significant that could make, other than the distances over which we were interested in were relatively large. So the plume is relatively uniform by the time it impacts on the buildings. But you're right, in the wind tunnel, the distances between the source and the buildings would be a lot smaller. So how applicable that approach would be across those two scenarios, I am not clear on. So it's a good question.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I think there's a question from the chat from Pawan. Pawan, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Oh,
you want
yeah,
me
thanks.
to...
Yeah, so just just a small question. Like it's mentioned that the radionuclide is of the size of 0.5 to 0.6 microns. Like in one slide it was mentioned.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering whether if like we have got air filters like HEPA 13 and HEPA 14s, again, it's time of the COVID. We were talking a lot about the HEPA filters. So just wondering whether these filters will be able to reduce the concentrations of these radionuclides from the room, and will it affect the radiation dose there?
So that's an interesting point. So I'm assuming those filters aren't going to be on the houses that were built sort of pre-1990, which at the moment is the dominant sort of housing stock in the UK. But as the housing stock changes and evolves, that sort of thing will more and more have to be taken into account, right? And so that sort of thing will become more and more significant.
Yes, means I'm just intrigued actually. Like we talk about that indoor sheltering. We are talking about the indoor sheltering, and then we are talking about the radionuclide, like how it is affecting us by way of inhalation, right? That's what I understand. So again, my second point is that these small size particles, they are going to stay in the air for a longer time. Like even in the indoor, they are going to stay for a longer time there, because they will not be settling, because they are the lighter particles, they will not be settling and they will be remaining in the air. So does it mean that it is going to overexpose us there? And if there is a chance, if we use these filters, again, I'm not an expert or anything, no, just I'm intrigued actually, because we are talking about COVID particles and other things. So I'm intrigued if we use this kind of a filter in a room, whether they can help us in getting the reducing the doses, and will it affect the numbers that you are talking about, like 0.6 and 0.63 at this stage? Or?
So I'm not familiar with the filters. But potentially it will, if they can remove those size particles as the air ingresses into the indoor environment, it will significantly reduce the inhalation dose, because they're the predominant particle sizes that are are in the environment. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks. I think we have a final question from Bernard. Bernard, are you able to mute yourself? I can ask the question. Basically, Bernard is asking, would airtight buildings offer a better level of protection against radiation?
In general, would airtight buildings offer a better level of protection against radiation? Yes. I mean, they did 1 or 2 studies where the building was totally airtight and then people ran out of oxygen. So obviously you've got to be careful that there's still some sort of infiltration in the building. But yeah, generally, the more airtight the building, the more protection you'll get, as long as that airtightness is focused on the sort of particle sizes that are most likely to arise in nuclear type accidents.
Thank you very much. I mean, clearly, we all have to breathe, and you have to keep oxygen levels sufficient. I understand that. In 1980, I was down in Porton Down as a young officer and put through the NBC courses. I also did a warning and reporting course. So at a relatively young age, I was exposed to this in rather difficult circumstances, and I had a very, very basic understanding. I think it was a sort of level of understanding that was given to most young infantry officers at the time. And it's interesting to see how this has now developed. Personally, right now, I am involved in a device which will detect, locate, and measure air leaks in buildings as small as 0.06 millimeters. And then with the help of the National Physical Laboratory, we discovered the algorithm that enabled us to quantify air leaks and to measure the airflow rate through air leaks as small as 0.5 millimeter in diameter. So it is of interest to me. Thank you very much indeed.
We more and more we've been looking at impacts of sheltering in terms of how it impacts humans in sort of the other impacts on humans in terms of their mental health and their physical health. So we found out quite a lot about after COVID in terms of people having to sort of stay in their home a lot more, and generally it's recognized that you wouldn't want to have to shelter for days on end. It's not a good thing to do, and sheltering really is a relatively short-term measure that you would employ ideally for a number of hours. If you suspect that the release is going to go on for a lot longer than that, especially over periods of days, then you'd probably be looking towards other protective action measures outside of the option of sheltering.
Yes, we were kept in bunkers in full NBC equipment. And after the first 24 hours or so, it got pretty desperate.
Yeah, I can imagine.
You know, it was absolutely horrific. And
Yeah.
I totally agree with you that, you know, we were trained soldiers, but
yeah,
certainly it's a question of an immediate reaction and surviving for 2 or 3 hours and then being evacuated.
Yeah. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Right. Thank you very much. I think we run out of time. It was a very interesting discussion and talk. So thank you again, Peter, and thank you everybody for attending this seminar. Don't forget that we have another seminar in 2 weeks' time. So please come back again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.